Narva Unleashed, the war that made Russia. What happens when a teenage king with a taste for war faces off against a paranoid Tsar obsessed with cannons and beards? How did Charles XII march through blizzards to crush an army 3 times his size? Why did Peter the Great flee his own siege and come back stronger than ever? Subscribe now and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the storm that turned Russia into a superpower. By 1700, Sweden was strutting like a peacock in a snowstorm. With a population of just 1.5 million, it punched way above its weight. Its empire stretched across Finland, Estonia, Livonia, Ingria, and parts of northern Germany. The Baltic Sea? Basically a Swedish bathtub. And its army, the Karelians, were the Beyoncé of battlefield choreography. Disciplined, deadly, and dressed to kill in blue coats with yellow facings. But power attracts envy like vodka attracts Russians. Enter Augustus the Strong, Elector of Saxony and King of Poland-Lithuania, who wanted a slice of Sweden's Baltic pie. Then there was Frederick IV of Denmark-Norway, still salty about losing territory to Sweden earlier. And finally, the wild card, Tsar Peter I, aka Peter the Great, who had just binge-watched Western Europe and decided Russia needed a glow-up. Peter wanted a window to the west, an ice-free port on the Baltic. But Sweden stood in the way like a frosty bouncer. So Peter, Augustus, and Frederick formed a secret alliance, hoping to gang up on Sweden while its new king, Charles VII, was still figuring out how to shave. Spoiler, Charles was not your average teenager. On February 22, 1700, Augustus kicked things off by invading Livonia. Denmark attacked Holstein-Gottorp, a Swedish ally. Charles XII responded like a Viking with a vendetta. He declared the war just, summoned his council, and said, "God will help us." Then he went full action hero. First target, Denmark. Charles landed troops on Zealand with help from an Anglo-Dutch fleet, because even kings need backup. On August 4th, his army stormed Copenhagen's doorstep. Frederick IV blinked. By August 18th, Denmark was out of the war, signing the Peace of Travendal. 1 down, 2 to go. Meanwhile, Augustus retreated from Riga. But Peter the Great was just warming up. He declared war on Sweden, aiming to reclaim Ingria and Karelia. His army? A mix of eager peasants and 4 decent regiments. Think IKEA furniture with only half the screws. Peter sent 8,000 men under Prince Trubetskoy to Narva, a fortress on the Narva River. By October, 63,000 Russians were camped outside the city, digging trenches and waiting for cannonballs like kids waiting for Christmas. Then came November 29, 1700. Charles XII, just 18, arrived with 12,000 frozen, exhausted Swedes. The Russians had trenches, earthworks, and numbers. The Swedes had frostbite and flintlocks, and Charles had audacity. As a blizzard raged, Charles rallied his men. Trumpets blared. The Karelians charged, straight into Russian lines. The snow blinded the Russians, their gunpowder got soggy, and their command structure collapsed like a poorly built snowman. By sunset, the Russians were routed. Thousands fled. Charles had pulled off one of the most improbable victories in military history. Narva was his mic drop. Across the Narva River stood Ivangorod, a fortress that looked like it had retired from warfare and taken up storytelling. Narva itself was no pushover. It was a fortress with walls that sneered at cannonballs. Under the guidance of Ludwig Nicolaus von Hollart, a Saxon engineer on loan from Augustus, because nothing says teamwork like borrowing a siege expert, the Russians built a siege line that would make a mole jealous. 4 miles long, 9 feet high, with a 6-foot trench in front. Basically, a dirt dragon guarding Narva. But Peter the Great's dream of a swift siege turned into a logistical nightmare. Roads turned to soup, wagons sank like sad ships, and cannonballs arrived slower than a Russian winter. By November 4th, the bombardment began. By November 17th, it fizzled out, because the Russians ran out of ammo. Cue the awkward silence. Meanwhile, Count Boris Sheremetev was sent west with 5,000 horsemen to play hide-and-seek with any Swedish rescue force. Spoiler, he found them. Briefly. While Peter was busy playing trench architect, Charles XII was plotting a winter campaign that made his generals clutch their fur hats in horror. March through Baltic mud and snow in November with 10,537 men and no food? Charles said yes, because Charles was built different. The Swedes landed at Pernau and began their muddy march. Rain turned to sleet, sleet turned to snow, and morale turned to mush. But Charles pressed on. At Pyayogi Pass, Sheremetev's cavalry tried to stop them. The Swedes skirmished, the Russians retreated, and the road to Narva opened like a frosty welcome mat. At Lagana, Charles fired 4 cannon shots toward Narva. The fortress replied with 4 of its own. Narva was still Swedish. Cue dramatic music. Hold a second, dear viewers. If you're loving this deep dive into royal drama and battlefield brilliance, don't forget to hit subscribe and tap that notification bell so you never miss the next twist in history's wildest saga. Now, back to the blizzard at Narva. At 3 a.m. on November 28th, Peter summoned the Duc de Croy, a veteran general and professional war tourist, and said, "Tag, you're it." Peter and Golovin were off to Novgorod for a war strategy brunch with Augustus. Ducroy, now in charge of 30,000 Russian troops, looked at the siege line and saw logistical spaghetti. Too long, too thin, too vulnerable. Peter's instructions? Don't fight, just hold the siege. Ducroy nodded. History smirked. At dawn on November 30th, Charles XII's army moved toward Narva. By 10 a.m., they reached Hermannsburg Ridge. Ducroy, mid-inspection, saw Swedish columns emerging like ghosts from the snow. He ordered his troops to stand to arms. Charles and Count Renschild surveyed the Russian lines. The defenses were intimidating. Ditches, ramparts, cannon-lined bastions. The Russian army was massive, but it was also static. No movement, no counterattack, just cold silence. Charles made his decision. Assault. Renschild drew up the plan. The Swedes would hit one section hard and fast before the Russians could react. It was madness. It was genius. The Battle of Narva had begun. Across the Narva River stood Ivangorod, a fortress that looked like it had retired from warfare and taken up storytelling. Narva itself was no pushover. It was a fortress with walls that sneered at cannonballs. Under the guidance of Ludwig Nicholas von Hallart, a Saxon engineer on loan from Augustus, because nothing says teamwork like borrowing a siege expert, the Russians built a siege line that would make a mole jealous. 4 miles long, 9 feet high, with a 6-foot trench in front. Basically a dirt dragon guarding Narva. But Peter the Great's dream of a swift siege turned into a logistical nightmare. Roads turned to soup, wagons sank like sad ships, and cannonballs arrived slower than a Russian winter. Swedes would hit one section hard and fast before the Russians could react. It was madness. It was genius. The Battle of Narva had begun. As Charles XII's columns descended from Hermannsburg Ridge, the blizzard intensified, turning the battlefield into a swirling white canvas. The Russians, blinded by snow and chaos, couldn't see the Swedes until they were practically in their laps. The Swedish assault hit the Russian line like a lightning bolt. The Karelians, trained to fight in tight formations, advanced with terrifying precision. Their socket bayonets allowed them to fire and stab without switching weapons, a brutal advantage in close quarters. The Russians, strung out along a 4-mile line, couldn't reinforce fast enough. Units panicked. Some fled. Others surrendered. The Guards regiments fought valiantly, but they were overwhelmed. The Swedish columns broke through and wheeled inward, encircling the Russian center like a tightening noose. Ducroy, the reluctant commander, was paralyzed. His orders were ignored. His troops were scattered. His defenses, so carefully built, were now crumbling under the weight of Swedish steel and snow. By mid-afternoon, the Russian army was in full retreat. Thousands drowned trying to flee across the Narva River. Others were captured. The Swedes took over 20,000 prisoners, more than twice their own number. Peter the Great, safely tucked away in Novgorod, received the news like a punch to the soul. His army had been humiliated, his siege had collapsed, his dream of a Baltic empire had been shattered, for now. But Peter didn't sulk. He learned. Fast. He began a massive military reform. He built new regiments, trained officers abroad, and founded Russia's first naval academy. He modernized logistics, weaponry, and command structures. Narva wasn't the end. It was the beginning of Russia's transformation into a military powerhouse. Meanwhile, Charles VII basked in glory. Europe watched in awe as the teenage king had crushed a giant. But Charles, emboldened by victory, made a fateful decision. Instead of finishing off Russia, he turned south to deal with Augustus in Poland. That decision would haunt him. The Great Northern War didn't end at Narva, it evolved. Over the next 2 decades, Charles VII invaded Poland and dethroned Augustus. Peter rebuilt his army and founded St. Petersburg, his window to the west. In 1709, the tables turned at the Battle of Poltava, where Peter crushed Charles in a reversal of Narva's miracle. Sweden's empire crumbled. Russia's rose. By 1721, the war ended with the Treaty of Nystad, and Peter the Great emerged as the architect of a new Russian empire. The Battle of Narva was more than a clash. It was a pivot point. It showed the world that courage could defy numbers, that failure could fuel transformation, and that empires are forged not just in victory, but in how they respond to defeat. And it all began with a teenage king, a paranoid Tsar, and a blizzard that turned history on its head. And just as Charles XII's frostbitten warriors prepared to storm the Russian trenches, history was about to be rewritten in snow and steel. As we close this chapter, covering the chaos of Narva's battlefield, make sure you're part of our army of history buffs. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a royal thumbs up, and smash that notification bell so you never miss another tale of czars, traitors, and tactical brilliance. Because trust me, what happens next? It's not just epic, it's empire-shaking.